Imagine a time when a tiny mechanical arm popped out of your car's door pillar to signal a turn, and a hand crank at the front was your backup if the battery went flat. Today we take a look at 15 car features Britain will never see again. The starting handle was standard equipment on virtually every British car built before the 1960s. This L-shaped steel crank inserted through a hole in the front bumper or grille and engaged directly with the crankshaft. Turning it by hand generated enough momentum to fire the engine when the electrical starter failed or the battery ran flat, which, in the damp British climate, happened often. The technique required care. Drivers were taught to grip the handle with their thumb on the same side as their fingers, never wrapped around, because a backfire could spin the crank violently in reverse and break a thumb or wrist. The Morris Minor, Austin A40, and MG TD all shipped with starting handles into the 1950s. As electrical systems became more reliable and engines grew larger, the physical effort required made hand cranking impractical. By the mid-1960s, most British manufacturers had quietly dropped the starting handle from their standard equipment list, though some, like Citroën, continued to include them on air-cooled models sold in Britain into the 1970s. If you climbed into a British saloon car built before the mid-1950s, you would not find flashing amber indicators at the corners. Instead, the car relied on trafficators, small illuminated semaphore arms housed in recesses on the door pillars. When the driver flipped a switch on the steering column, an electromagnetic solenoid would thrust the arm outward with a distinct mechanical thwack. A small bulb inside the amber arm would glow, not flash, to signal the intended direction of travel. The most common unit on British cars was the Lucas SF80, and brands like Tex and Trico produced similar designs. However, trafficators were notoriously unreliable. The recesses collected dirt, polish, and moisture, causing the solenoids to jam. In winter, they could freeze shut entirely. Drivers routinely had to lean out and slap a stuck arm back into its housing by hand. By the late 1950s, flashing indicators mounted at the vehicle's corners had become the legal standard, and the trafficator disappeared from British roads within a decade. Before air conditioning reached the average British motorist, every car had quarter lights. These small triangular windows, set on hinges forward of the main door glass, could be angled outward to scoop air directly onto the driver and front passenger. In Britain, they were commonly called quarter lights, though other names included butterfly windows and breeze windows. The mechanism was simple, usually a chrome latch and a friction hinge that held the glass at whatever angle the occupant chose. Quarter lights were especially valued by smokers, who could angle the glass to draw cigarette smoke out of the cabin without the blast of a fully open window. General Motors began phasing them out in America by the late 1960s, and British manufacturers followed through the 1970s and 1980s as air conditioning became standard and aerodynamic design took priority. The hinged quarter light also created a security weakness, since a firm push from outside could pop one open and allow a thief to reach in and unlock the door. One of the most distinctive features of any pre-war British car was its running boards. These flat steel platforms ran along both sides of the vehicle between the front and rear wheel arches, bridging the gap between the high-mounted body and the road. On early cars with tall, narrow chassis, they were essential for climbing into the cabin. Running boards also served as mounting points for spare fuel cans, toolboxes, and even spare wheels. On British cars like the Austin 7, Morris Oxford, and early Rolls-Royce models, the boards were typically finished in pressed steel with a ribbed rubber mat for grip. Children used them as makeshift seats on short trips, and mechanics stood on them while leaning into the engine bay. As car bodies grew wider and lower through the 1930s, the running board became an obstacle to sleek, streamlined design. By the time British manufacturers resumed production after the Second World War, most new models had adopted slab-sided bodywork that eliminated the running board entirely. In the 1930s through the 1960s, British cars featured a floor-mounted dip switch for controlling headlight beams. Rather than using a stalk on the steering column, the driver would press a small metal button on the floor with the left foot to toggle between main beam and dipped beam. If you have ever driven a classic British car at night, you would recognize the tactile click felt through the sole of the shoe as the beams changed. Lucas manufactured the most widely used version for British cars, and the system was more common on British vehicles than on continental European ones. As the British car industry declined through the 1970s and foreign manufacturers gained market share, the column-mounted stock became universal. The floor dip switch vanished along with the domestic marquees that had favored it. However, many owners of classic Rovers, Austins, and MGs still consider the floor switch a superior piece of ergonomic design. Long before electric headlamps became viable, British motorists relied on acetylene gas lamps bolted to the front of their cars for illumination after dark. Common from the 1890s through the 1920s, these brass fixtures worked by dripping water onto calcium carbide pellets inside a small generator mounted on the running board or mudguard. The chemical reaction produced acetylene gas, which was piped through rubber tubes to the lamp heads, where it burned behind a polished reflector. The resulting flame produced a bright white light far superior to the oil lamps that preceded it. However, acetylene lamps demanded constant attention. The carbide had to be replenished, the water reservoir refilled, and the jets cleaned to prevent blockages. Wind could extinguish the flame entirely. As electric headlamps powered by dynamos became viable in the 1910s and 1920s, acetylene lighting was phased out, though some rural British motorists continued using it well into the late 1920s. Today, working acetylene lamps can still be seen on veteran cars at the annual London to Brighton run, their gentle white glow a reminder of how dark the roads once were. The mechanical hand throttle was a standard fixture on the dashboard of most British cars built before the 1950s. This was a small lever or knob, usually mounted on the steering column or dashboard, that held the engine at a set speed independently of the accelerator pedal. It functioned as a crude form of cruise control, allowing drivers on long, empty stretches of road to rest their right foot. It also served a practical purpose when starting the engine from cold, since pulling the hand throttle would raise the idle speed and prevent stalling while the engine warmed up. On cars like the Bentley Mark VI and the Rover P5, the hand throttle was a finely machined brass control mounted on the steering column. As automatic chokes and improved carburetor design made cold starting easier, and as traffic density increased on British roads, the hand throttle became unnecessary and gradually disappeared from production models by the early 1960s. If you drove a British car in the 1950s or 1960s, the chances are your instrument panel carried the name Smiths somewhere on its face. Smiths Motor Accessories, based in Cricklewood, North London, supplied virtually every British car manufacturer with speedometers, tachometers, fuel gauges, oil pressure gauges, and water temperature gauges. The instruments were mechanical, driven by flexible cables that connected directly to the gearbox or engine. The speedometer needle responded to the physical rotation of the cable, giving it a slight, characteristic bounce. Smiths dials were finished in black with white or cream markings, and higher specification models featured chrome bezels and elegant typefaces. The company also produced clocks for the dashboard, though these were famously unreliable and often ran slow. As British car manufacturers were absorbed into foreign ownership through the 1980s and 1990s, electronic instrumentation from continental suppliers replaced the Smiths mechanical gauge. Today, Smiths instruments are sought after by restorers willing to pay premium prices for original, working units. Long before power steering became widespread in Britain, drivers had to wrestle with unassisted steering racks that required genuine physical effort to turn, especially at low speeds and during parking. The typical British saloon of the 1950s and 1960s used a Worman sector, or recirculating ball steering box connected to the front wheels through a series of track rods and ball joints. Turning the wheel of a stationary Rover P5 or Humber Super Snipe required both hands and considerable upper body strength. Women drivers in particular were marketed larger, thinner steering wheels specifically to provide better leverage. The early Minis, despite their small size, were notoriously heavy to steer at parking speeds because of their front-wheel drive layout and wide tires. Power-assisted steering began appearing on luxury British cars like the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow in 1965, but it would take until the 1990s for the feature to become standard across all segments of the market. The twin SU carburetor is one of the most recognizable components of the classic British engine bay. SU, which stood for Skinner's Union, was founded in London in 1905 and became the dominant carburetor supplier for British car manufacturers by the 1930s. Unlike conventional fixed-jet carburetors, the SU used a variable Venturi system with a piston that rose and fell inside a suction chamber, automatically adjusting the fuel-air mixture to match engine demand. The mechanism relied on engine vacuum and a simple dashpot filled with light oil to dampen the piston's movement. Most British sports cars of the post-war era, including the MGB, Triumph TR6, and Jaguar E-Type, ran twin SUs mounted in parallel. Tuning them required balancing the airflow through each carburetor using a length of rubber hose held to the ear, listening for an even hiss. As emissions regulations tightened through the 1970s and 1980s, fuel injection systems replaced the SU across British production lines, and the Skinner's Union factory ceased carburetor production entirely. Today, rebuilt SU carburetors remain essential for classic car enthusiasts, and specialists across Britain still make a living tuning and restoring them by hand. Until the 1968 Road Safety Act made seatbelts compulsory fitment in new British cars, and long before the 1983 law requiring their use, front bench seats were a common feature in British saloons and estate cars. The bench seat ran the full width of the cabin, allowing 3 adults to sit abreast in the front. Models like the Ford Zephyr, Vauxhall Cresta, and Austin Cambridge all offered front bench seats with column-mounted gear selectors to keep the floor clear. The upholstery was typically leather or vinyl, and without textured surfaces or lateral bolsters, passengers would slide freely across the seat on sharp corners. The shift to individual bucket seats was driven by several factors. Seatbelt legislation required fixed mounting points that worked poorly with bench designs. Floor-mounted gearboxes offered more precise shifting. As cars grew narrower through the 1970s, 3 abreast front seating became physically impractical, and the front bench seat quietly disappeared from British showrooms. In the early decades of motoring in Britain, the car horn was not an electric device, but a rubber-bulbed brass horn mounted on the outside of the vehicle. The driver would squeeze the rubber bulb by hand, forcing air through a metal reed or trumpet to produce a loud, distinctive honk. These bulb horns, sometimes called squeeze horns or klaxon-style horns, were common on British cars from the 1900s through the early 1930s. They were mounted on brackets attached to the scuttle panel or windscreen frame, within easy reach of the driver's left hand. The sound they produced was surprisingly powerful for such a simple device, carrying well above the noise of early traffic. As electrical systems became standard equipment, the electric horn replaced the bulb horn entirely. However, the brass bulb horn remains one of the most iconic visual symbols of early British motoring, still seen on veteran and Edwardian cars at rallies and concours events across the country today. Lucas Industries of Birmingham supplied the electrical systems for nearly every British car manufacturer from the 1920s through the 1980s. This near-total monopoly meant that every dynamo, starter motor, ignition switch, wiper motor, and headlamp relay on a British car bore the Lucas name. The company had originally marketed its headlights under the brand name King of the Road, but by the 1960s, the widespread unreliability of its products had earned the company a very different nickname, the Prince of Darkness. Lucas switches featured exposed contacts mounted on bare metal panels that invited corrosion. Bakelite components wore down with use, creating false connections. Brass connectors were left untinned, turning green with age. The problems were not so much failures of engineering as they were consequences of cost-cutting imposed by British Leyland and other struggling manufacturers who demanded cheaper components. As the British car industry collapsed in the 1980s, Lucas lost its captive market and was eventually absorbed into foreign ownership. The Lucas name survives only as an aftermarket brand, a quiet ending for a company that once wired an entire nation's motor cars. The hand-operated windscreen washer was a standard fixture on British cars long before electric pumps took over the job. The system consisted of a small rubber plunger mounted on the dashboard or floor, connected by a thin rubber hose to a washer jet at the base of the windscreen. Pressing the plunger forced a squirt of water, mixed with a few drops of methylated spirit in winter to prevent freezing, onto the glass. The driver then activated the wipers, which on many British cars of the 1940s and 1950s were themselves vacuum-powered, meaning they slowed to a crawl when the engine was under load going uphill. This combination of manual washer and vacuum wipers made driving in British rain an exercise in optimism. As electric wiper motors and washer pumps became reliable and affordable in the 1960s, the hand pump vanished from British dashboards, replaced by a simple stock-mounted button that handled both functions automatically. If you peer under the bonnet of a British car built before the late 1960s, you will almost certainly find a dynamo rather than an alternator. The dynamo, a direct current generator driven by a belt from the engine, was the standard method of charging the battery and powering the electrical system on all British cars from the earliest days of motoring. Lucas manufactured the most common models, including the widely used C39 and C40 units found on everything from Morris Minors to Jaguar Mark IIs. The dynamo's principal weakness was its output at low engine speeds. At idle, it produced almost no current, meaning that sitting in traffic with headlights, wipers, and heater blower running could drain the battery faster than the dynamo could replenish it. The alternator, which produced alternating current and was effective even at idle, began replacing the dynamo on British cars in the mid-1960s. By the early 1970s, the dynamo had disappeared from new production entirely, though thousands remain in service on classic British cars today, maintained by dedicated owners who know exactly how to set the brush tension and polarize the unit after reconnecting the battery. So which of these lost British car features do you miss the most? Drop a comment below to tell us your pick. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and watch the next one right here. And remember to like and subscribe. It really helps a small channel.